This lecture is essentially given for the benefit of those of you who are entering this present spring term. At the same time, I shall be saying some things which will also be perhaps a little new or of interest to those of you who've been with me either the last term or the last two terms. So I suggest you hang around and listen for the occasional point that might have some new significance for you. The format of this course is probably known pretty much to all of you. In the last couple of years, I've tried to use closed-circuit television to bring the professor to the class rather than to, as so often does seem to happen, divorce him from the class. If you were one single group of 500 or 600 students in a very large lecture room, I obviously wouldn't see too much of you individually, and certainly there wouldn't be too much real communication between us. This way, by cutting the class into 6 sections and coming to one section every other week, I do assure that I get to you by the end of the year. I know most of your faces at least, and some of you I know a great deal better because I think by coming around this fashion, I stimulate more of you to buttonhole me as I walk around the campus or to come to my office from time to time. The format then will be that every other week I will be in each section. Now, in the last 2 terms, I came the first the first week of the term, and then alternated every other week after that. This time it's going to be turned around. I'll be coming to you for the first time in the second week of this term. I hope to come to all of the 6 sections next week, and then we will talk about a number of things that may, after you listen to me today, somewhat confuse you about procedures. I'll be glad at any time to clarify any point about procedures that may be troubling you. Now, in that period when I do come to you, I have, of course, to cut down the regular lecture for that day. If we're going to discuss for 10, 15, sometimes a few more minutes, I obviously have to take out about 1/3 of the lecture, and that is a considerable misfortune. I'm very happy that for next year I'm going to be able to do the thing a little differently. As you know, the Arts College in 1971-72 is going to essentially go over to a system of 4 and 5 credit modules. Now, in this case, I'm moving the class to the winter and spring and give it on a 5 credit basis, meaning then 5 times a week. That gives me a little extra time. Instead of 9 hours per year, I'm going to have 10 hours next year. And under those circumstances, I believe that it can be arranged that I come to each section for a full hour, that we have a real back and forth with my also raising some questions and not just having you question me. I'd certainly not want to keep a record of your performance in such a class, but really have communication to bring up questions, for example, that I have to skip over very fast during the regular lectures, and to take up problems of very broad significance. But this year we still have to pursue the other system, and here, incidentally, for those of you who are around the campus on Wednesday, there is a chance to hear always the full lecture that has been taped for that particular hour, and which is then replayed. We always replay each week the lectures of the previous week, so that every Wednesday night, beginning at 5:30, there will be the 3 lectures of the previous week. The first of them, of course, starting at 5:30, the second one around 6:15. It takes a little while to roll these tapes back, so there'll be a little pause there. So probably more like 6:20, and the third one beginning shortly after 7 o'clock. So in that fashion, students who are ill or for some other reason must leave the course, must be absent on a certain day, can make up all the lectures for the past week or any particular one that they may have missed. I'm always asked by students, do I mind if they go just to those lectures? I don't mind at all. The main thing for me is that you have an opportunity to hear all the 3 lectures. We do not police you, as you know, in this course, and you can come or not come exactly as you see fit. Though I personally don't see much sense in a student enrolling for a course where he doesn't trouble to get whatever interpretation the lecturer might be able to give him. But in any event here, if you want to do that in the easiest way by coming only Wednesday nights, of course you must be careful that during the last week when we'll be playing the lectures of the week before, you go to classes during that last week of the term. But otherwise, it's up to you. If the pressure of students on Wednesday nights in the makeup room, that is number 116 Ford Hall, 116 Ford Hall becomes too great, and of course we'll have to add different rooms or change to a larger room. I depend on you to let me know if that class is too crowded, that makeup class on Wednesday nights. We will have to make such changes. But it's up to you to make up your mind exactly how you want to get this. Of course, if you come Wednesday nights, you'll miss whatever lecture I give every other week. Some of you want to come that particular lecture. As nearly as possible, I like to stick to the very specific rhythm I have mentioned, starting then with my personal appearances, as we might call them, in the second week of the term, and then every other week to the end of the term. I naturally am very happy if you come to see me in my office hours. I find each year that I have some of my most interesting contacts with members of the class who come in during office hours and perhaps just chew the fat, talk about things that interest them in the subject of World War II history, or just about any problems they have in connection with their studies. I'll be delighted to have you do that. I could have many more of you do it than actually take advantage of such an opportunity. Of course, if all 500 plus of you did that, then naturally I would be overwhelmed, but I have no fear of that. I'd be very happy then to have more of you come in, and my office hours will be pretty much the same as last term. That is, Mondays I'll be available each week, the third and fourth hours. Then in the week in which I'm appearing in classes, that's the week I appear in classes, but in weeks I don't appear in class and have then the third hour vacant, I'll also be there Mondays and in third hour. In other words, all the way through every other week, beginning this first week, from second hour through fourth hour. And then on Tuesday every other week in the same way, beginning with the first week, the present week that you hear this lecture, I will be available also in third hour on Tuesday. So Monday always, second and fourth, every other week also the third, Tuesday every other week the third hour. And my office is in 725 of the Social Science Tower. 725 of the Social Science Tower. Now, I'd like to also say something about the question of your obligations. And we have only 2 examinations in which your performance is tested, a midterm and a final. It has been my habit throughout the last 2 decades or so, and not to count the midterm grade if your final grade is substantially better, if it hits a clearly higher level. For example, if you had a midterm grade of some rating of C minus plus or whatever it might be, but the final examination is a B, then B will be your grade. I know some students always wonder why bother then to have a midterm. There are, of course, always some of you, far fewer than improve, but there always are some of you who do the opposite. Perhaps a fifth of the class that changes its grade at all, it does so for the worse. And in that case, I do average the grades in. In other words, your midterm then can bring up your final grade. But it's much more often the other way around. 5 times as many students, I'd say, improve in the final grade as against those who don't do as well. And so here is your chance to really catch hold and do much better. There are so many of you in this class who come from other colleges and have perhaps had no other history courses. I often find that such students flounder a bit at the start, but after a midterm or so, they begin to hit their pace, and by finals, they are doing just as well, and sometimes individually, of course, better than the regular arts college students and social science majors who naturally find things a little bit easier at the start. With reference to reading, I do not have a textbook in this course. There is no really good book that covers all of World War II. I have in recent years, and again this year, recommended that if you feel you need something to tie things together, you buy a fairly cheap paperback Lewis Snyder, Snyder, The War, A Concise History. It isn't available at the present moment, perhaps, in all the campus bookstores, but I've made an effort during the between terms period to check on this, and they are going to make a special effort to get them in. This costs you 95 cents. It is not worth the 95 cents. If you already are pretty well acquainted with the framework of the war. On the other hand, for those of you who are starting now or who first want to have something to help tie things together, it's a fairly good return for your money. Your reading in general should be from this list here. This list is one that is available in the bookstores on both sides of the river. I've asked that it would also be available in Nicholson bookstore this term, and believe that by now it is. I'm sorry that the price has been increased, but there's nothing I can do about that. I assure you I make no personal profit from it, and I believe the history department barely breaks even on the considerable work that goes into mimeographing this bibliography. It's available for both the 20th Century Europe course of Mr. Van Holland and for this present course. In other words, 20th Century and World War II. It's broken down on a chronological basis. The first period, or the first bibliography, as I call it, bibliography 1, covering the period down to 1918. The second one, in between the wars period, and the third one, which deals with the actual era of World War II, beginning with the immediate background and going through the 1945. That is the one that, of course, will be by far the most important for you. Do, however, give some attention to bibliography 1, because aside from covering the books that deal with Europe down to 1918, I also have had to make this a kind of a catch-all section of bibliography, because, of course, many books cover more than one section of the century. For example, there might be a book dealing with French history from 1910 to 1950, and that obviously would cover material ordinarily in bibliographies 1, 2, and 3. So such a book I lump with bibliography 1 and do then occasionally skim through that to see whether some of the books there, though they cover the century more broadly, aren't perhaps the best thing that you could read on certain topics. Now, in the very beginning of this bibliography, you have here a page and a half of instructions which will repeat some of the things I'm saying today and say some additional things, give you especially a notion of how much reading you should do and also how you report upon it at midterm and final examinations. Graduate students have one extra requirement, which is also incidentally described in that introduction. They must select a book of so-called primary source type. I am surprised always that there are some graduate students who don't seem to know what that is. It means a book which gives you direct evidence on the history of the period or subject involved. And, for example, somebody's diary, memoirs, official documents of the period, anything like that. And, of course, usually the students find it most interesting to take the memoirs of one or another significant personage of that period. But it must be a primary source type, and be sure to check with me after 2 or 3 weeks to ask me whether your selection is acceptable. Just doing this when I visit your particular section will be quite sufficient. But this is the check I have, that some of you, despite what I say now, don't become confused and take a book of secondary type, which means then a study by an historian giving his opinions and interpretation of a certain period, rather than to give that direct evidence which a memoir writer, for example, is able to give. When I come to the classes individually, I'll have to say a little more about readings. There are certain ways in which you can make much better selections than others, and here and there as we go along, I'll give you some hints as to how you can do this most efficiently. This bibliography has been revised at the end of 1970. It's then fairly up to date, but of course the moment it appears already is somewhat obsolete. But there always are other books appearing week by week. There probably is more historical literature on World War II than all the rest of history combined. And so during this very term, there will be books appearing which will be, of course, the most up-to-date on their particular topics. Don't neglect them. Kind of watch out for books which will be new, but which will therefore not have been available at the time when I made up this last revision of our bibliography. Now, I'd also like to call your attention to one particular resource that has been available for the last couple of years. About 3 years ago, we had the good fortune that a British group decided, under the chairmanship of the famous military historian, Captain B.H. Liddell Hart, who died, unfortunately, a year and a half or so ago. Captain Hart then and his associates put out a weekly study on some aspect of World War II. This was done for 2 years, one each week. And then the success was so great that they kept it up and went even more into detail in other topics, or dealt with some very general topics for another year or so. And now, incidentally, a new series is running on World War I. Now, I ordered 2 sets of this. The one set for our library on the West Bank and another one for the East Bank. And so it should be easily available to you. And you'll find this, of course, often somewhat popularized. In fact, a number of these are much too popularized and not worth very much. But you just take the average. I think it's worth reading them. And you'll find here the kind of thing which you see here. Here, for example, is the problem of the American force in the Philippines, the famous fighting in the connection with the island of Corregidor. Here, the very next is the Burma campaign. Here you find one that deals with the fighting at Stalingrad, one of the really more decisive battles of World War II. Here is the siege of Sevastopol, the famous Soviet fortress city in the Crimean Peninsula, and I know that this particular volume includes the Battle of Midway, for example. It deals here with the infamous crime, the killing of Polish prisoners, officers, non-commissioned officers, fairly early in the war, and the controversy which has arisen as to who were the villains of the peace, who was responsible for their wholesale, genocidal, you might say, killing, and so on. This is just here one of 6 folders that deals with the first of the series that I've mentioned, and the one of 98. And some of you, incidentally, might still wish to get this. You will find at the beginning of each copy instructions as to how to order them. I've always had some students who spend the full $55 or so for the original series, and sometimes I've followed them also with the supplementary series. I used to be able to refer you to the bookstore. I had the bookstore purchase 50 copies of each of these studies in the years when they were coming out. But unfortunately, most of them are sold, and the publisher doesn't have enough to add to our stock. So you still can, in the Anderson bookstore, I think, find odd copies on this or that subject. But if you want to get the whole series, your only chance is through the publisher himself. As I said, this is quite popularized. It's easy, interesting reading. There's always, or almost always, one main topic for a particular weekly issue, and then there also would be in that same issue 3 or 4 other topics which are treated perhaps only for a page or 2 and are then not given the same kind of emphasis. This is then also very much acceptable for your reading, even though it is not listed in the bibliography. With reference to names, naturally we're going to have hundreds of names that are sufficiently difficult for Americans to catch in the first place when they're mentioned, and then not easy to remember. And when I mention a foreign name, obviously I won't bother with a comparatively simple name like the French DuPont and the German Schmidt and Schultz and so on, very common names in America. But when the name has the least bit uncertainty in spelling, for example, I will have that spelled across my chest here for the taped lectures, and in the lectures where I am personally visiting you, I'll either spell them out for you orally or put them, as I imagine I will do in most cases, on the board. But our bibliography here has at the end a list of names. One list is, here you see, is one of geographic terms, and the list right ahead of that is are the names of people. And so you can check again on spellings in our bibliography, and it's, of course, a rather useful way also of reviewing what you've taken that term. If you go through the list and see what names you recognize, and where you don't recognize them enough, perhaps do some additional studying, looking them up the names in an encyclopedia or one of the books that deals broadly with the war, you'll find it useful in that sense. And of course, while we don't penalize you for misspelling names in midterm and final examination, it always makes a bad impression if the student in a wholesale fashion falls down in visualizing the spelling of the name of the person who has played enough of a part in our story to be brought to the attention of the class. Then, with reference to our procedures, I hope very much that you will help us to improve them. There hasn't been a year where members of the class haven't made suggestions which I found useful. Sometimes I'll have to tell you we just can't do it that way. The mechanics of the situation, of the taping of the lectures and so on, or the time available, simply won't allow this kind of thing. But very often, constructive suggestions are truly that and are very welcome to us. So please, whenever you can think of a way in which you believe we can do things better in this course, do bring it to my attention. Incidentally, aside from my office hours, I'm perfectly glad to spend some minutes after each lecture staying around the room or walking back with you through the halls and dealing with shorter discussions that you might want to raise about one topic or another. I'm very happy to, before I start a lecture, to ask for questions of any kind or a chance to clarify something about our procedures, which may be somewhat uncertain in your mind. Also, incidentally, we are going to this term have some time before it is over an opportunity to ask you questions about the course. We'll give you a questionnaire, and we'll ask you to be so kind as to give us your reaction to certain aspects of our procedures. And of course, again, we especially welcome suggestions as how we can improve this kind of thing. Now, I'd like to quickly run over what we're going to cover during the present term, because students always find it of use to have especially the order of appearances of particular topics with which we deal. At the end of the winter term, we were just in the middle of the story of the Anglo-American landing in northwestern French Africa and the consequences of that in the fighting in that part of the world. I have not yet come to the last part of this, which deals especially with the final phase of the fighting in Tunisia and the end of the military career in Africa of the very famous German general Erwin Rommel. So there will be one lecture finishing up this topic, and then we have two lectures on the overthrow of Mussolini in the summer of 1943, with, of course, a good deal of background to it. Then the war in Italy after we landed on the Italian mainland. Then come a series of lectures which have to do with the German economic performance in particular and scientific performance in the war. The first is the general story of German armament. And then I deal with the great Allied bomber offensive, which naturally had German war economy as its principal target, and can examine that offensive from all standpoints, its successes, its failures, its general significance in history. Then comes the failure of the Luftwaffe, the fact that the German Air Force, which at the beginning of the war seemed to be the best in the world, in fact, very likely was the best in the world, having only one rival, the Royal Air Force of Britain, how it finally failed to live up to the requirements for which it had been created. Then another Hitler failure comes for consideration, the V weapons, the various secret weapons which were developed by the Germans or which they tried to develop. In some cases, of course, they didn't get them done by the time the war came to an end, which is really one of the more interesting stories of World War II. I follow with two lectures on the conspiracy against Hitler, which led to the famous bomb attempt on his life in July of 1944, and which was followed by the horror of the trials of these men before the so-called People's Court and the wholesale hanging of what really were, in many respects, the finest elements in Germany. And that will include, incidentally, a showing of the film on the trials. We have a film which was made specifically for Hitler, which is then essentially the story of how these men were abominably treated during the trials, and we don't have the reel that has to do with the executions, but I'm sure that most of us wouldn't care to see that anyhow. I accompany that with a running comment so that I will, I hope, make up for the fact that the trial itself naturally has to be in the German language. And even for those of you who know German, there's great disappointment here because the tape isn't very good with respect to the oral side of it, and I'm afraid that you won't understand most of that. But generally speaking, I found that students, even though they know no German, find this a grim but very interesting experience. Then I come to the background of the famous Anglo-American landing in France. I call that Overtures to Overlord. Overlord is the cover name for this famous operation. And then the following lecture deals specifically with D-Day in the West. And then comes the Second Battle of France. We usually refer to Hitler's famous Western offensive in 1940 as the Battle of France, or now we sometimes call it the First Battle of France. The second battle is the Allied counteroffensive of 1944. After the landing, the fighting in France itself, to the collapse of the German forces there at the end of the summer of 1944. Then the Eastern Front, we cover that in the second term for the years of 1941-42 and down to Stalingrad, the beginning of 43. Here comes now a lecture dealing with the war on the Eastern Front in 1943 to 1945. The final lecture on the fighting in Europe I call Payday for Nazi Germany. It deals then with the last agonizing months of 1945 in which Germany was invaded from east and west and finally completely collapsed. And the death of Hitler is, of course, the climax of that story. Then we shift back to the Pacific, which I covered in the second term, down to the famous Battle of Midway, May-June 1942. And beginning then with the situation after Midway, we have 4 lectures which deal with the war in the Pacific and the problem of the surrender of Japan, associated therewith naturally is the development and the decision to use the atomic bomb. And this ends with the surrender of Japan in August of 1945. Now that's as far as I've gotten in the past, but we're starting a little later in the present term than we did before, and I'm happy to say that I'll be able to offer at least one additional lecture. I have 3 that I would like to give at the end, which, as I say, I haven't given before. One is on the conferences of Yalta and Potsdam. In other words, the decisions of the Allies with reference to the post-war world, especially Germany. And then a lecture on the famous Nuremberg trials after the war, and a final one, if I get that far, which I doubt, on the beginning and the general character of the occupations of Germany and of Japan. Now that then is very briefly summarized the procedure for the present term. Now I mentioned that next year the course will be given in winter and spring on a 5-credit basis, and some of you who are studying the course now may puzzle how you can finish it. I think we can arrange that fairly well. If you start the course at this time, spring of 1971, then I believe that you can just about cover the rest of the term by taking the 5-credit course in the winter of 1972. And in that connection, may I say that if some of you have had the last winter and the present spring term and want just to make up the fall term of this last year, then I'm going to try to make an arrangement. I think the Arts College will be helpful to me in trying to figure it out, by which you can register for the next winter term for only 3 credits or so, and then have your examination, your completion of the course at the end of a period when I have roughly dealt with the same material that in this and in past years I have dealt with down to midterm. So in this kind of situation then, it should be possible for you to complete the course, whether you have entered now or entered at the beginning of the last winter term. You'll be given an announcement later as to just how we are going to handle this. Perhaps we can definitely make the arrangements by the end of this term so you know where you will be at during the coming academic year. Now, with reference to the registration cards which you are carrying with you, I suggest that if you are near either KUOM or the history office, you bring them in the history office, put them in my mail slot there, but don't make any special trips. You can hand them to me when I come to the individual classes. Remember that I come to each class the second week of this term and then every alternate week. I naturally am ready to receive you in my office hours beginning this first week of the term, and hope that any of you who find anything confusing what I've said today will come around and let me clarify whatever points are troubling you. Well, that completes our discussion today. We haven't quite taken up the whole 45 minutes, but remember that I'm available to you to deal with any further aspects of the whole problem of procedures during the entire term, and especially, of course, beginning in my personal appearances next week. Thank you.